Thank you. Welcome everybody to this session today. I'll begin by introducing myself briefly. My name is Hareth Al Bustani. I'm a senior consultant for arts and culture at Burson, which is a global communications agency. I'm an author and a former journalist as well. Unlike myself, our guest today needs little introduction. An award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and filmmaker with BBC, ITV, and Channel 4. She served as the chair of the Royal African Society and president of SOAS. She traveled across more than 30 countries, unearthing stories to produce the History of Africa documentary series. And today, she joins us to discuss her subsequent book, An African History of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Zeinab Badawi. This book opens with this really beautiful line, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, but the line is that everyone is from Africa, and this book is therefore for everyone. And what you're alluding to is, you discussed the dawn of man, human, and the Homo sapien, and how people originally, the dawn that emerged in the African continent, and then migrated out to the rest of the world from there. And that has a real resonance here because, as you mentioned in the book, the first place they traveled through was the Arabian Peninsula. And we have archaeological sites in Sharjah and Malaya which show human history more than 100,000 years ago during that migration. And in the years since, we've always had a very strong connection here between the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, North Africa, and subsequently the whole African continent. And that's something that continues to this day. And we also have had our own run-ins with colonialism. I mean, whether it was the Portuguese and the British, we've had our own encounters with the colonial world, and obviously everyone all over the world has their own experience of colonialism on one side or the other. We're living at a time where people are now finally starting to reckon with that history and question their history, and we're having conversations about repatriation of looted artifacts and reparations, and there's debates where we're seeing backlashes against that, and it's a very heated conversation at the moment, and I think it's a very important conversation, and this book comes at a really interesting time. So with all of that said, I'd like you to kind of take a moment to kind of introduce the book, to give us some sort of frame of reference, and kind of explain why you felt it was so important to write a book at this time.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed, Hareth, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much indeed for taking some of your Saturday to come along and listen to this session. It's very lovely to be with you all and wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Dubai. So, yes, I felt compelled to write this book. In a way, the book found me rather than the other way around. As you alluded to, I made a history series called The History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi, which was broadcast on BBC's international channel. I went to more than 30 African countries over the period of 7 years, and I interviewed dozens and dozens of African historians, anthropologists, paleontologists, you name it, and put out the TV series, 20 45-minute episodes, all available free of charge on the BBC YouTube channel. But I felt very troubled when I came back to the UK because I felt I hadn't done justice to the marvelous scholarship that I had encountered on my travels in Africa. And I was also very struck by the fact that everywhere I went, I'd often arrive late because of the traffic or whatever, trying to pack too much in one day. And every one of these African experts, scholars, and so on, so polite to a man and woman. They say, oh, don't worry, don't worry. And I thought, and I'd have to drag myself away from them at the end of each interview. I'd be there maybe for 2-3 hours. And I felt there's something going on here. They knew that I was going to put out their words on the BBC's international channel. And I thought, these people have been starved of an international public stage. And so I felt that I had to do their scholarship justice. And that's why I wrote the book, because I couldn't really cover everything that they had, told me about. And I also felt that as somebody who has read a lot about African history, that the voice of the African expert had been very absent from the international stage. and I didn't think this was right. So my book is not about supplanting some of the very good work done by Western historians, the Africanists, many of whom I count amongst my friends, but it's about supplementing their work. Because unless you include the voice of the African historian, you will miss something out of Africa's history. And moreover, I wanted to really dispel this myth that Africa had no history until the arrival of the Europeans. Africa has the longest history in the world, as you say. Everybody is from Africa. If you're not born in Africa, from Africa, living there today, you are an African export. Whether you're blonde-haired and blue-eyed, you know, the history is settled. Africa is where the human story begins, and there's nobody on earth today who cannot say that Africa is not their mother continent, which is why I wanted to start the book in the first chapter about the origins of humankind, to just emphasize our common origins.
And I think you've brought with you some images of some of the most fascinating or unappreciated elements within African history that I think a lot of people are not aware of. For example, I'll just give one example and then hand over to you. For example, some people might be surprised to learn that the wealthiest man or the wealthiest person in history was actually Mansa Musa, right, who was the ruler of Mali, and was so incredibly wealthy that he went on spending sprees that destabilized the global economy, right? Would you like to share some more examples that you think people aren't really aware of but should be?
Yeah, you mentioned Mansa Musa, but unfortunately, Hareth, that's like slide number 6 or something, so I'll come to that if I may. Yes, you're absolutely right. I felt that my work was actually in a way almost like a detective uncovering these untold stories. The people, even actually on the continent of Africa itself, I was very struck by the level of ignorance about Africa's history before the arrival of the Europeans, so from, you know, before the 15th century, let's say. And also Africa's ancient history is quite a remarkable one. So one of the early chapters, everybody knows a bit about ancient Egypt, so I'll gloss over that one. Although one thing I do in the book is at the beginning of each chapter, I try to look at a contemporary issue and try to, you know, say to the reader, this is why you should be interested in this history. With the ancient Egyptian one, I again engaged in this debate about why people tend to exclude ancient Egypt from Africa and feel that it's sort of, you know, not part of the African continent. And I show in that chapter that actually the history of ancient Egypt has always been in Africa and always will be part of African civilization. But I'll jump to the third chapter, which is from where my roots are. I was born in northern Sudan, but I've lived in the UK since I was 2 years of age. So you can probably tell from my accent. Even my Arabic has an English accent. And that was the Kingdom of Kush, which is northern Sudan. And I focus particularly on the 8th century BCE, before Common Era, or as some people say, before Christ, BC, because that's when the Kingdom of Kush reached the zenith of its power. The kings of Kush conquered Egypt and governed it for the best part of a century. And the country in the world that has more pyramids than anywhere else, maybe we can see the first slide, is Sudan. There are 1,000 pyramids in Sudan. About 250 of them preserve their superstructure, so you can see them either fully standing or the base. There are about 100 pyramids in Egypt by way of reference. And so these are just some of the examples of the pyramids of Sudan. The next slide shows you some black granite statues of the kings of Kush, the ones I'm referring to, with names like Taharko, Shabako, Shabitku. And these were known as the 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt. So they conquered Egypt, governed it for the best part of a century. They built magnificent temples. Some of the marvelous ruins that you see, or temples that you see in Egypt, some of them were built by these pharaohs, Shabako in particular, who ruled in the 700s to the 600s, was known as Shabaka the Builder. And these kings of Kush always buried themselves in what is northern Sudan, in those pyramids that I saw. So the idea that they were Nubians, which is often what you hear, I don't refer to them as Nubians at all, because first of all, the term didn't appear until the 3rd century AD, or Common Era, and it tends to obscure their origins as Northern Sudanese. They always hailed from a part of the world which has always been Sudan, nothing to do with Egypt. If you call them Nubians, they can get confused with the fact that there are Nubians in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. So, I mean, they were marvelous. Taharko is mentioned in the Bible. They were not only an African civilization, they were a regional superpower. They were protectors of King Hezekiah of Judah against the marauding Assyrians. They were protectors of the princes of Byblos and Tyre in modern-day Lebanon, you know, in Phoenicia, as it was then. So, you know, I love their history because I identify with it, but also because it tells you how empires rise and fall. At the time when these people were presiding over, you know, a kingdom of great richness, and some people actually credit the Kushites with being the first people to enamel pottery. You know, in their earliest iteration, the civilization far predates ancient Greece and Rome. So that's what I like about this particular aspect of ancient African history, and it's been very much, you know, overlooked by its more glittering neighbor to the north. The kings of Kush, interesting enough, I'll be very quick, is that what I like about them also is that people often think that history is something which is just consigned to the past. And of course, history explains our past, but it also informs our present and helps shape our future in a way. And the kings of Kush, as all the Kushites did, considered it an abomination to eat fish. So imagine they had this plentiful source of protein in the Nile, but they just didn't touch it, perhaps because of its rotting qualities. And to this day, the northern Sudanese have the lowest, or one of the lowest, consumption of fish in the world. It's about 1 kilogram on average per person per year, compared to Egypt, 25 kilograms per person per year. So it just shows you, you know, I've got a brother who hates fish, and I say to him, it's your old Kushite memory at play here.
What would you say was some of, in your trips, obviously, you know, in writing this book and in preparing the series as well, you've traveled all across Africa, you've interviewed experts from all kind of backgrounds. What were some of the things that you personally were most surprised to learn in all your travels?
I was taken aback, and I consider myself a fairly educated person. I was taken aback by the sheer richness and diversity of Africa's history, because, you know, I'd been educated through the British education system. I was an undergraduate at Oxford University studying politics and economics at a time when there was a historian by the name of Hugh Trevor Roper, highly respected man, a professor of history, who was very famous for writing a book where he said that, you know, there's only darkness in Africa, and darkness is not a he said there's only darkness in Africa before the arrival of the Europeans, and darkness is not a subject for history study. And he said, you know, we can just amuse ourselves with the irrelevant, he said, amuse ourselves with the gyrations of picturesque but savage tribes in irrelevant corners of the globe, something like that, more or less. And to think that this was somebody who was still part of the Oxford academic establishment at a time when I was a student there, not, you know, okay, quite a while ago, I'm not that young, but it just shows you how, you know, remarkable that has happened, that kind of thought, you know, exists, and to some extent still exists today, that people feel that Africa, you know, it doesn't have a history at all. And I wanted to show in this book, and I was surprised, and I was very glad that I was vindicated, that Africa has a history, institutions, traditions, customs that are worthy of study, that are worthy of respect. And I think that was the thing that impressed me the most. I can't remember what the next slide is. Can you show me? Oh, yes, now this is Mansa Musa, you mentioned. Can I talk about him? So Mansa Musa was the best known of the kings of the Empire of Mali. So the Empire of Mali was established in 1285 by somebody called Sundiata Keita, who was the great-great-uncle of Mansa Musa. Mansa just means king. The name of the kings of Mali was Mansa. And Sundiata Keita established the Mali Empire in 1235, and in 1236 he set down something called the Mandi Charter, because he was from the Mandi people. And Mandi people are sometimes referred to as the Malinki, the Mandingo, the Mandinka. And he set out an oral charter which said that all the people in his empire, which covered huge swathes of West Africa, of the Sahel, you know, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and so on, huge empire, he said everybody should enjoy liberty, dignity, and equality. It was an oral charter. We can date it probably because the Arabs recorded it. So it's an oral charter which UNESCO actually designated part of our intangible heritage. Why I mention the Mandi Charter is because the Mandinka, or the Mandi people, formed some of the largest cohorts in the transatlantic slave trade, where people were dehumanized and seen as being sort of subhuman, and yet one of their forefathers had the foresight to, you know, set out this Charter of Civil Rights, really, which has echoes, doesn't it, of the French Revolution, you know, liberty, fraternity, and equality. In any case, this is Timbuktu that you're looking at here. And Timbuktu was one of the most famous cities in Timbuktu. It became a center of great learning. The Mali Empire was made up of about 400 cities, settlements. And the next picture, I think, is of Mansa Musa. So you can see Mansa Musa here with the golden crown, holding a golden orb in his hand and a golden staff. And this features in a Catalan cartographer's map of the world in 1375. Mansa Musa was born in 1280 and died in 1332. Born in 1280, died in 1332. So this map is in 1375, and it shows you his significance that all those years later he would feature on this map. Why did he feature on this map? Because he is reputed, as you said, to be the richest individual to have ever lived in history, because the Mali Empire had lots of gold mines and so on, and he, you know, had lots and lots of gold. By some measure, he would be worth 435 billion US dollars today. And he's perhaps best known for embarking on a massive pilgrimage to Mecca, because by his time, the Mansas of Mali were Muslim, and he set off on this pilgrimage in 1324 with a massive entourage of about 60,000 porters to carry all the stuff for his household, 12,000 members of his household, 60,000 porters, 500 personal servants, and about 100 camels, all carrying between 10 to 15 tons of gold. He spent so much money in Cairo en route to Mecca and on the way back that the global price of gold plummeted by about 25%. It lost 25% of its value and didn't recover for for more than a decade. But what the story of Mansa Musa shows you is that the actions of a medieval West African king had an impact on the global economy. So this idea that Africa was somehow dislocated from the rest of the world, that there are those who make history and those who stand on the sidelines of history, is very disproved by, you know, the story of Mansa Musa. 8 panels in this map of the world, and he's the 3rd panel. So I think the next one is, yeah, that's a close-up of him there. Sorry, I'm lecturing a bit, aren't I? Not answering your questions.
No, not at all. It's fascinating. And this touches on something that we kind of were discussing earlier about how with the Arabian Peninsula, there are similar misconceptions where people will sometimes say, well, there's not really much history. They might say, well, you have the rise of Islam, but before that, there was nothing really going on. But actually, the more archaeological expeditions that are taking place, like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, for a long time, there were areas like Al-Ula where there wasn't really much archaeological activity. But now there is archaeological activity undergoing, and it's reinforcing this idea that the Arabian Peninsula has always been this area that wasn't just kind of separate from the world, minding its own business, but has always been a critical part of, it was an extension of the Silk Route, the maritime Silk Route, on the peripheries of the Roman Empire, the Nabatean Empire, etc. But in that case, there's a combination where I think part of it is willful ignorance of people who believe that. There's also, like you say, some areas where there hasn't been enough archaeological work taking place. But in the case of the African continent, there's been at least a century of heavy archaeological work, for example, in Egypt. And for example, when you talk about medieval history, this is something that isn't that far back and would have been known by scholars in the Mediterranean or in Europe at the time. So why do you think that these misconceptions have lingered for so long? And do you feel like, at what point has this started to shift, and has it actually started to shift as much as it should have?
So I'll confine myself to Africa, although you're completely right about Arabia. And for instance, the port of Jeddah was one of the great ports of the ancient world. It really came to the fore in the 800s, you know, as a vital trade for a route for Red Sea trade. It took over from Adulis, which was in modern-day Eritrea. So I think part of the problem is that the climate in Africa is very difficult to sometimes, you know, excavate, certainly in countries like the Sudan, where it's so intensely hot that actually archaeologists can only work for a very short period of the year. In the case of Sudan, from October to March. Instability, as we see in the case of Sudan, means that a lot of people won't venture to these places. Also, for countries which only gained their independence 60, 70 years ago, you know, archaeology isn't exactly at the top of their priorities. And this was told me, you know, by Dr. Weber Ndoro, who's a great Zimbabwean archaeologist who's responsible for training so many archaeologists across Africa, you know, pleads with, you know, African countries and says you must invest more in your archaeology. And there just isn't, you know, there aren't the funds. But I think there's another fundamental reason why Africa's history has been overlooked, is that Western historians tend to put a great deal of emphasis on the written word. And of course, documentary evidence that's written is very, very important. Hence, this is why Western historians will tend to pick up Africa's history from their arrival. And you say, you know, there wasn't much so-called pre-colonial history. There's just the history of Africa recorded by the Europeans in European languages. But that does a disservice to covering Africa's history, because obviously there's a fine tradition of oral tradition in Africa, whereby knowledge is passed on, you know, orally through people like, you know, like the griots in West Africa. Father would pass it on to son, mother to daughter, and so on. And these sources are often overlooked by Western historians. And archaeology also does tell us a lot, which sometimes, you know, marries up with oral tradition. And this is what I liked about the African historians, because they are in their country. So in Congo, you talk to a Congolese historian, in Algeria, an Algerian historian, whatever. They are, you know, fully versed in their oral tradition. They know what has happened. Because in the West, knowledge is often seen as something which is held by the individual. In Africa, knowledge is held more communally. I mean, that is the kind of approach to life that the Africans have on the whole that differentiates them from Western societies, you know, where there's a lot more emphasis on the individual, the nuclear family. Africans, you know, have always been much more community-driven. You know, the Southern African word, Ubuntu, I am because of you, and so on. So, and another reason why Western historians tended to overlook African history is they looked at their own sources and overlooked, for example, Arabic or Persian or Gujarati. And the Arabs were in Africa from about the 7th century, much, much earlier, hundreds and hundreds of years before the Europeans. And they wrote a great deal. You know, you have the chroniclers and, you know, Ibn Battuta and all the others. So this is another reason why I think that, you know, globally, Africa's history has been overlooked. And this is why, at least I try in my book, which is why it's called An African History of Africa, to try to kind of redress that balance and use these more multiple sources, using volumes which were compiled by UNESCO in the early 60s. they started a project at the behest of the newly independent African leaders like Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere. They said, look, we've decolonized our countries, we want to decolonize our history. So UNESCO facilitated this big project for them called the General History of Africa, and they scoured the continent for the best experts, paleontologists, archaeologists, historians, and they compiled volume after volume of Africa's history written from an African perspective. They're quite turgid, these volumes, but I did use them greatly as a source of research. So I think it's, for those reasons that Africa's history has been largely overlooked.
And in terms of going forwards, especially with regards to how we treat things like oral history. I mean, for example, in this region, that was a big part of how we documented our own traditions and history was through oral history, because people were illiterate up until the modern age. But in terms of African history, going forward, so how do you think we need to adapt the ways in which we educate people in African history, whether it's regards to how we treat oral history, or whether it's perhaps, as you say, piecing together sources from different cultures, so from Arabic, Latin, African sources, and really piecing all that together. What do you think we need to do going forward to really reinforce how it's taught?
I mean, I think people have to understand that, Africa did write in many cases, but even when Africans did not write, it does not mean they did not record their history. You just have to get at it in different ways. Dance tells us something, as I said, oral tradition, poetry, songs, praise songs and art. So I think that people have got to understand that there isn't just that documentary evidence approach to history, and also that some of the documentary evidence we have that's written by Western observers, the missionaries, the explorers, the colonial officers, can often be slanted. So if you take somebody like Shaka Zulu, who was born in 1787, and you look at accounts written about him by, Western historians or explorers, it's very different from what the Zulu historians will tell you. The British accounts might say, he was a bloodthirsty tyrant, and you'll often read about, how he just went around, pillaging and killing people and so on. But Zulu historians will tell you give you a very different, side to him. He was a composer, a great musician, would often sing to his soldiers and so on. And, he established the idea of a soldier king. He was a great military strategist and so on. Because obviously, when you look at history through the lens of the conqueror or the victor or whatever, you'll get a very different slant. So I think we have to take some of the accounts that we take as gospel truth with a pinch of salt. There's a lovely Southern African saying, which is, when the lions have historians, then the hunters will cease to be heroes. And I think that is very true, and that is what I would say about African history, or for that matter, any part of the world. You've got to include the perspective of the people of the region themselves, otherwise you'll miss something and you'll have a very slanted view. And in answer to your question about how African history should be taught, I mean, I'm a great Pan-Africanist, and I think that for people on the continent, I hope that in my book I don't just relate and narrate the history, which I do. I try to give a comprehensive sweep of the continent, north, south, east, west, central, including the north, because I don't accept this kind of bifurcation of the continent with the Arab north and the rest. I was born in Sudan, which is very much at the crossroads of the Arab and African part of Africa, and I think that it would be wrong to hive off part of it and just say it's just part of the Arab world. Of course, the Arabs did conquer pretty much all of North Africa by 711, which is a long time ago, and they mixed and gave their language and religion. But, one doesn't mean that we completely overlook the history of the Berber or the Amazigh, as they like to be called. And it's true that once you get to the Ottoman conquest of North Africa from the 1500s, it then, does become a bit different from the rest of the continent. But you've got to keep the continent as a whole. And I think that there are many common experiences that maintain that kind of a Pan-African approach to African history, which is the experience of colonialism, as you said at the beginning. It's a great unifying factor for the whole continent. You know, Mandela, when he was released, the first country he visited was Algeria in the far north to thank them for their solidarity during the apartheid era. And, you know, just as I live in the UK and people accept the history of Rome and Greece in southern Europe as part of their heritage, then I think Africans shouldn't say, oh, I'm from West Africa, I'm only going to be interested in Mansa Musa and not interested in the north, the east, the south, or whatever. I think we should have that approach. And I would like to see African history not seen as African history, but to say to everybody, even if they're not African, is part of our global story. And it needs to be, you know, better known about. And that's why I hope my book in some way is contributing to that. But I think for the African reader of the book, it's not enough to just narrate it. I felt that I also had to provide a history of hope, because if you look at Africa today, you know, you can be filled with dismay, not to mention what's going on in my country of birth. But I think that's what history teaches us. If you use the long lens of history, rather than just looking at it in the short term, and in the long term, I mean, in some cases, 25 years, you have a lot of, you know, cause to be optimistic.
This is something that I, as a former journalist and a history writer myself, really appreciated about your book and your approach towards history, because for me, what I think is perhaps most important about history is that it helps us to better understand where we are today and where we're heading in the future, because it gives us a context of where we've come from. And I think that when you look at some of these misconceptions, I mean, for example, growing up, when I had never traveled to Africa, and whenever I was exposed to Africa, for example, I mean, it could be Ethiopia, it could be as the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa, the associations that you build are famine, the kind of malaria, very kind of suffering, conflict. This is the kind of screen time that we got. But there's a gentleman called Michael Parenti who once said, poor nations are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. And it kind of reframes the history a little bit, because, for example, you point to Mansa Musa, and he shows that, well, actually, this isn't a continent that has just always been completely barren of resources and barren of any hope, but actually quite the contrary. And I wonder, how important was that for you to address, and how relevant do you think that is to Africa? And why do you think it's so important that going forwards we do kind of break down those myths and focus more on, for example, there's something you highlight in your book, are the incredible resources that Africa has, this large young population, again, natural resources. I mean, there's a lot happening to be hopeful for. And could you kind of elaborate on that a bit, please?
So, no, you're absolutely right. I think most people have that kind of stereotypical view of Africa, you know, the coup, the war, the famine. And as I said, there is plenty of that on the continent, but you cannot reduce an entire continent to just that. You have to have a multidimensional approach to it. And why it's important is that there was a recent study done by Africa Practice. There's an organization alongside Africa No Filter, and they calculated that Africa loses at least $4 billion a year in lost or potential foreign direct investment because of these negative perceptions. So it actually has an impact on Africa's ability to attract investments. And so it's not just, you know, a fanciful thing that, oh, well, you know, that's what people think of Africa. It has an impact. And I think that part of what I'm doing by reaching back into the centuries, the history, to say, you know, Mansa Musa, at a time when in a few decades Europe was going to be, you know, completely decimated by the Black Death, the plague, and, you know, people were languishing under the difficulties of that. There was this kingdom flourishing. Is to kind of just to set the record straight in a way. And it is important because it can obscure the great wealth of Africa. So, you know, Africa is the least developed part of the world, for sure. And it needn't be. That's, you know, the case at all. But I think it would be wrong to see Africans as sort of underdeveloped Europeans or whatever. They have to find a way of forging their own identity based on their own customs and traditions and institutions. But as you say, I am optimistic about the continent because it is the youngest continent in the world, and everybody knows from your own, memories, when you're young, you've got vigor, you've got ambition, you've got energy, exuberance, and so on. And Africa is, the average age is 18 in Africa. If you think in the UK, it's 42, in France, 41, in Italy is 47, in Japan, 49, even the US and China at 38. Africa is by far the youngest place. And by 2050, a quarter of the world, because its population will double, a quarter of the world's workforce, producers, consumers, workers are going to be Africans. So, we're going to have to think of the future as African, because these will be the people who, basically are going to keep the world going because they are so young. And then Africa also has a strong card to play in its hand because it is home to some of the world's, minerals, the earth minerals that we need for our technological revolution, coltan and bauxite and so on. And if these are developed in a responsible way, they can really redound to the people's, bring prosperity to the people. I mean, it's a big if, especially when you see what's going on in the DRC with, the problems all going on there with the M23 rebels and it's a very mineral-rich part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is a bit disheartening, but if it was developed properly, then the sky's the limit for Africa.
Something as well that kind of going back to kind of connecting with your kind of career in news, something I noticed myself when you go to certain Western publications, let's say you visit the landing page, the homepage, there might be a day where an awful atrocity happens somewhere in the West, and let's say, the hypothetical, let's say 10 people are killed, and on the same day you'll have an atrocity that happens somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, 300 people killed, and for some reason it's always buried in the hierarchy. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that also traces itself back to this colonialist, this history of colonialism and the way that Africa is perceived in other parts of the world?
I mean, I don't think it's so much colonialism as it is that, we know there's a hierarchy of, lives, as it were, and you're absolutely right. You can have, 150,000 dead in the current conflict in Sudan and 25 million people food insecure. It's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and yet it gets very little attention. And it's not ignorance about this suffering that's going on in Sudan, it's indifference. And I think that people are kind of, more immune to suffering. In sub-Saharan Africa, they kind of just take it, oh, well, it's par of the course, this is a backward part of the world, so what do you expect? It could be rooted in, as you say, that kind of colonial thinking, which has led to a kind of infantilization of the people, and also the idea that they can only pull themselves out of this if we go in and help them or whatever. That it's always the partnership. The Africans are cast as the junior partners, and everybody else as the more senior partner. And I think that this robbing Africans of agency and seeing them as passive spectators is all part of this, which is why I think, you counter that kind of mindset by saying, actually, look, Africa's got this, amazing history, and let's just, get that straight and get that right. And so you can't redress that now without reaching back and, dispelling those ideas that Africans are only seen in the world, in Europe, North America, whatever, as the descendants of enslaved people and nothing else. And that's why I think history is very, very important in helping overturn those kind of stereotypes.
I think some of the examples that spring to mind are, and you document these in your book, is throughout history you have these incredible, strong female leaders in their societies. You have some who are kind of, I think, like de facto, like, I never know how to pronounce it, but Hatshepsut of Egypt, who was the wife of Thutmose II and the mother of Thutmose III, who ruled kind of for decades. Of course, you have like Nefertiti, Queen of Sheba, but also you mentioned a lot of other fascinating leaders. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I think the next slide might show one of those. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, that's it. So that's because I wanted to in my book. I mean, first of all, I focus on personalities in my book because I think that famous British historian Macaulay said, you know, history is best understood if it's seared into the imagination. And I think that's best done through a personality-led history. You know, we all know about the Tudors in Britain because of Henry VIII and so on. So I focus on personalities a great deal, and I also wanted to feminize the history where I could, because I think people take that HIS in history a bit too seriously. It's also her story. And so this is Queen Njinga, who was queen of the Ndongo kingdom, which is in modern-day Angola. So she was born in 1583 and died in 1663. And what I like about Njinga's story is that it kind of overturns this idea that when the Europeans arrived in Africa from about the 1400s and then eventually conquered Africa, so we all have the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 when the European powers carved up the continent amongst themselves, that the Africans didn't resist. Africans resisted, you know, their colonial encroachers, at the Europeans coming in at every turn. And Queen Njinga illustrates that very well. So this is an etching from the 17th century. So Njinga, her brother was on the throne by then, but she was really the most able of the royal family. Her father, when he was king, had marked her out for greatness. Her name Njinga means to twist, because she was born with the umbilical cord around her neck, which denoted somebody who was marked out for greatness. And her father took her to all his, you know, councils and, you know, when he was adjudicating in cases and so on. And she learnt at his knee, and she was very effective at wielding the fighting axe, so she was quite brave herself. Anyway, when her father died and her brother became king, he was quite ineffective. By then, the Portuguese were encroaching on their land, and they were taking away a lot of enslaved people, and including from their own people. So her brother said to her, look, go and appeal to the governor of Luanda, who was a Portuguese chap, and he said, you know, go and tell him, look, you can take other people as enslaved Africans, but don't take, you know, from our people. So she put on her fine jewelry, and she went from their capital, Kabasa, which was about 250 miles from modern-day Luanda, and went to see the governor of Luanda. And when she arrived in his tent, he was sitting down on a chair, and he motioned to her to sit on the rug on the floor. And she thought, oh, I'm not having any of that, because I'll be, you know, it'll be showing that he's superior to me and so on. So she commanded the tallest of her female attendants, you can see there, to go on all fours. And she sat on the poor unfortunate woman for hours while she negotiated with the Portuguese governor at a higher level. So that very much captures Njinga's spirit. And she fought the Portuguese because they didn't, you know, make peace. At every turn, 25 years, she just outrun them at every turn, and they never quite managed to subdue her. One point when she was in her 40s, she abseiled with some vine across a creek, and all the Portuguese soldiers fell to their death, but she got safely to the other side. And she died, as I said, in 1663 in her 80s with her crown firmly on her head. It did succumb to the Portuguese in the end, but that's what I like about Queen Njinga's story, is that it shows you know, that there were real women leaders. Her brother killed himself, so she eventually became queen, which was quite unusual for the Kingdom of Ndongo, which was a vassal state of the Kingdom of Congo, spelt with a K, which covers part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, and Angola today. But if you go to Angola, next slide, this is, if you go to Luanda, this is at the former Portuguese fort in the capital, Luanda. There's this magnificent bronze statue of, we'll just go back a bit, yeah, thank you, of Njinga there. So that's me standing with her, so you can see the scale. She's a real heroine to the people there.
Well, I'd love to carry this conversation on, but I'm sure some people in the audience will have some questions of their own. So I'd like to take a moment to open up the floor. And we have a question over there already. over here in the back. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Zeinab. I just wanted to ask you what you think the re-election of Trump and the emergence of China as a superpower investing heavily in the continent and climate change will mean for the continent. Sorry, I know that's a triple-pronged question, but...
So I'll pick up global warming first. I mean, it's well known now that Africa contributes 3% of global carbon emissions. And if you strip away the industrialized north, the more industrialized north, the rest of Africa accounts for 0.5 percentage point of global carbon emissions. So you can see that there's a little bit of a dissonance in the climate debate, in my opinion, because a lot of the debate is dominated by the global north, where they talk about mitigation, fewer lights, less air conditioning. I shouldn't say that in the Emirates. Don't fly so much, blah, blah, blah. This doesn't resonate with people in Africa, where adaptation is the most important aspect of climate change. You can't will it to rain if it's not going to rain, so you need to adapt to changing climate. But there is a sense of injustice in Africa that the continent that's least contributed to global warming needs investments in green technology, needs the technology transfer, needs the funds. And we saw that at the recent climate summit in Baku in Azerbaijan that, it was a disaster for the global south because the funds are just simply not there. And so Africa is bearing the brunt of that. In terms of China versus the US, what I will say about China is this, is that yes, China is a big player in Africa, but it's not the only big player. And I think that there's a great deal of exaggeration or focus, particularly by the media, on China in Africa. In terms of the figures, China accounts for about 15% of global trade that goes into Africa. It also accounts for about 14% of global FDI that goes into Africa, foreign direct investment. So the United States and the EU are much bigger contributors also in terms of, development aid and so on. And I think the focus on China does obscure other big players like Turkey, like India, like the Emirates. And so I think that, we need to just make sure that we don't just say China, China, China versus the US. And people look a lot at the infrastructure projects that China develops in Africa as being the real bellwether. But often, once you go beneath the surface, you see that these so-called Chinese infrastructure projects are actually just projects that the Chinese have won on an international, tender, and the money actually might be coming from the European Union or from somewhere else, but it's the Chinese perhaps who are leading the construction, and the Chinese don't like to disabuse people of that impression. It's like, yes, 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 we are building all of Africa. So I think you have to sometimes look, at the figures, and Africa attracts, 3% of global FDI. I always say if Africa had a PIN code, it would be 333, because it's about 1.3 billion people, accounts for about 3% of global FDI, 3% of global warming, and about 3% of global trade. So, in terms of its significance to China, it's not as great. Having said that, yes, everybody's interested in the earth minerals that Africa has. And China, its actions in Africa, like everybody else, good and bad. There's some good they've done and there's some bad they've done. But I think the idea that African countries get these really expensive infrastructure projects and that if they don't pay their loans back to China, that China will somehow go and grab the family silver is not quite right. The Chinese are very aware of the fact that that would redound to their harm and that governments and civil society would really start kicking back at that. So good and bad.
Hello, good afternoon, Zeinab. Congratulations on your new book. I grew up watching you on Channel 4 News, so it's absolutely delightful to see that you're as eloquent and as erudite now as you were, back then, almost 40 years ago. So my question is, do you think that the emergence of AI is an opportunity for Africa to catch up with the rest of the world? You know, you mentioned about Africa being the least developed region in the world. What do you see as the tools that Africa can use to catch up and, you know, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, you know, everybody points to the mobile phone, what happened, you know, with the mobile phone in Africa, that Africa could just leapfrog and not bother about laying down landlines, which is true. Can that be replicated through AI? I think certainly in some cases, yes. Health, education, we're already seeing, you know, AI, technology, digital revolution being deployed in a way which will help Africans. And certainly, you know, Africans are rapidly urbanizing, and so they can build the new cities of the future, harnessing, you know, all the power of the new digital and technological and, you know, AI revolutions. And certainly, you know, AI teaching is already being used. But you know, you do need to have good internet connection, which is still woefully lacking in large parts of Africa. So I think that, and also the know-how, you know, there is a bit of a brain drain. A lot of Africans are very technologically savvy, but an awful lot of them leave the continent and work elsewhere. So you need, you know, technologically savvy, skillful people to really deploy what, you know, the benefits that AI could bring. And if people are leaving the continent, you're going to have this, you know, skills gap. So I think a lot of things have to, and also you need the investment. So I think a lot of things have to be in place. But I think that on the whole, my guess is that Africa will benefit disproportionately from AI, from the digital and, you know, technological revolutions. And you already see it. I mean, Kenya, more than 90%, 92% of electricity in Kenya is from renewable sources, which is quite remarkable. More than 90% of households in Kenya use some form of mobile phone money, more than anywhere else in the world. So you can already see, you know, how it's being used. Farmers find out, you know, prices in the markets through, you know, mobile phones and so on. So I would say yes, that Africans could build the cities of the future and the countries of the future using the products of the fourth industrial revolution, rather than our creaking, mature economies in Europe, which, you know, really have to renovate and rehabilitate, and that's expensive.
First of all, I'd like to say, I feel, maybe I'm speaking on behalf of more than one person here, but I feel privileged to be in your presence. And on behalf of the collective, thank you for your work in bringing so much awareness to Mother Africa. I'd like to know if you have any, or if you found during your research and your travel through Africa, if you found any evidence of matriarchal system.
Oh yes, plenty. Matriarchal systems, certainly the Asante in West Africa, in what would be modern-day Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, had a matriarchal society until quite late, until the 1600s, when they suddenly transferred to being ruled by a king. But who your mother was still very important, and the line of succession remained matrilineal. And then you have matriarchal society, and also staying with the Asante, you have Ya Asantewa, who was born in the 1840s in modern-day Ghana. And in 1900, she was the Asante Queen who rallied all the people of Asante, because the British by then were really conquering the lands of the Asante, and there were the Anglo-Asante Wars, and the men had kind of given up. And Ya Asantewa, who was then in her early 60s, admonished the men and said, "What is it, you men of Asante? You're just taking, you know, this lying down." And she said, "You should swap your loincloths for my undergarments, and if you, the men, won't fight, then we, the women, will." Then they heeded her call, and she rallied 20,000 men, and they put up a really good fight against the British, ultimately defeated, but you know, they kept them at bay for a while. So she was the great Asante Queen, and actually when Ghana became independent, it changed its name from the Gold Coast to Ghana, and Kwame Nkrumah, the first president, made Ya Asantewa the kind of icon of this newly created country of Ghana, and she featured in postage stamps, and schools were named after her, and she became more than just an Asante queen. She became a kind of, national symbol. So a very clear example there of female leadership. Northern Sudan, where I was born, the queens of Kush, who I mentioned earlier on, the kings of Kush, but the queens of Kush were exceptional in the ancient world in that they could wield power, they could rule as co-regents with their husbands and their sons. And we have many examples of strong queens of Kush. They were known as Kandakas. So you have Queen Amani Renance in the 1st century, who in 30 BCE, before Common Era, fought the Romans. She was known as the one-eyed queen because she lost an eye in battle. And the Romans by then, of course, had conquered Egypt. Queen Cleopatra had died 30 BCE, and the Emperor Augustus became, Emperor of Egypt, and they set their sights on Northern Sudan. But the Northern Sudanese were having none of it. They fought, and they forced the Romans to sign a treaty with them in 22 BCE. So, and the word Kandaka, meaning Queen Mother, the Romans and the Greeks before them had misunderstood this to be a woman's name, and it's where we get the modern name Candace from, is from Kandaka. And in that revolution in 2019 against Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, women were very much in the vanguard, and they styled themselves and drew their inspiration from the Kandakas of the ancient world in Sudan, and actually called themselves, Kandakas. So you can see how, their history inspired them. But yes, matrilineal succession is something which was not uncommon in Africa.
I'm afraid that, although I would love to carry this conversation on for longer, but that does bring us to the end of the session. But before you all head off for the book signing, which will take place in the lobby, I'd just like to take a minute to thank you, the audience, and thank you for your questions, the AV team, volunteers and translators, our title sponsor, Emirates Airline, our founding partner, Dubai Culture, our parent organization, Emirates Literature Foundation, our session sponsor, Dubai Duty Free, and of course, thank you, Zeinab Badawi. Thank you.